Hello, welcome back. My name is Matt, and today we're going to be discussing the basics of steam locomotive technology and also what will be actually covered in the series going forward. I did say previously that I will be covering every steam locomotive that served in North America. However, that is not what I'm going to do. I misspoke. I'm going to be covering every locomotive built between the years of 1900 to the end of steam in North America, that roughly being 1900 to roughly the 1960s. So about 60 years of history, but there's still a lot to cover. In order for me to do that, I think it's very important to tell people how steam locomotives work, who built them, and exactly what will be covered, at least in terms of technicality. Now, the first thing we have to cover is how steam locomotives actually work. Steam locomotives are fairly basic in concept, at least in terms of the technology of the time. Steam locomotives were very advanced when they were first introduced. Just to break it down in very simple terms, fuel, whether that be coal, wood, or oil, is thrown into something called the firebox. The firebox then burns all this fuel and goes into these boiler tubes, or flues. These tubes are surrounded by water within the boiler. The water then boils, turning into steam. Steam is then routed down to these cylinders and various other systems. These cylinders then move the pistons, and on the pistons' return, they force the remaining, now low pressure steam out through the smokestack. Now, there are some other locomotive types that actually use this leftover steam. I'm not going to get into that. That is way too specific, and this is just the basics. Now, who built these engines? At least in North America, there were four principal builders. You had the Baldwin Locomotive Works, you had the American Locomotive Company, or ALCO, and then you had Lima Locomotive Works. Those were the three in the United States, along with one major one in Canada, which was the Montreal Locomotive Works. If I remember correctly, was a subsidiary of the American Locomotive Company. If you want to learn the history of these locomotive builders, I would very much recommend History in the Dark. His channel has all sorts of specifics on the locomotive builders and also the railroads themselves. The next thing we have to cover is something called the White Notation, which is actually how steam locomotives are classified, at least in terms of how many wheels they have. I will put up on the screen a classic steam locomotive. This is a 462 Pacific. What does that mean? That means this locomotive has pretty much all three of the numbers of the White Notation. 462 refers to the numbers of wheels it has, at least on the engine. It has 4 leading wheels, 6 driving wheels, and 1 trailing wheel. What does all this mean? Well, I'll break it down very simple. Leading wheels on the front came about as locomotives needed help negotiating curves. These leading wheels help the locomotive get introduced into the curve, and it makes locomotives travel over curves a lot smoother. Next, we have the driving wheels. Now, this is actually what moves the locomotive itself. These are the power. Essentially, like the driving axles on a car, it does the exact same thing. It moves the train. Finally, we have trailing wheels. Now, trailing wheels actually have more than one purpose depending on what locomotive you're talking about. It could either A, help the locomotive negotiate curves going in reverse, or they are there to help support a large firebox, essentially so the weight is more distributed along the locomotive size. The next thing to talk about with this White Notation is that the fact that different locomotives actually have different nicknames. Some nicknames are more more known than others, and other nicknames, are highly debated. Looking at you, New York Central. Anyway, so we're going to get into those. First type, going from smallest to largest, just as these videos will be structured, is the 040. That means it has no leading wheels, it has 4 driving wheels, and it has no trailing wheels. This is just known as a 040 switcher or a 4-wheel switcher. All depends on who you are. Next, we have the 060. No leading wheels, 6 driving wheels, and no trailing wheels. 060, classic switcher for North America. These things were everywhere. And, they were usually called either 6-wheeled switchers or just 060s. Just that switcher over there. Go do it. Go get it. Next, we have the 080. Getting bigger. It has no front wheels, 8 driving wheels, and no rear wheels. These weren't as common as the 060, but they were definitely more common than the 040. A lot of big coal railroads had these. That's because they were big, chunky, and generally had a lot of power for their size. And still, with no leading or trailing wheels, they can actually make it around really tight corners fairly easily. Next, we have the 242, the Columbia. This was not a very common wheel arrangement. Lionel makes a lot of models of these back in the day, but this was not very common just in real life on the railroads. It has 2 leading wheels, 4 driving wheels, and 2 trailing wheels. Pretty even locomotive. Next we have the 260, the Mogul. Our first proper, well, really our second properly named engine, but the Mogul is very well known for pretty much every freight operation at least in the United States. These were very versatile engines. Everybody had them at some point. Whether they were good or not, that is to be debated. But it has 2 leading wheels, 6 driving wheels, and no trailing wheels. Again, very common small freight locomotive. These things were everywhere. Next up, we have the 262, the Prairie. Now, this was only common on a few railroads, at least in the United States. 262s were not super common, but they were still very versatile locomotives. And as the nickname suggests, it was very much used for out in the plains, on the prairies. And it has 2 leading wheels, 6 driving wheels, 2 trailing wheels. Next up, we have the classic 440 American. The 440s were the pinnacle of the Wild West. In fact, when you think of a steam locomotive, you're probably thinking of a 440, at least an American type. These were only called the American type because they sort of sprouted up in the United States and just dominated the American continent until the 1900s. These things were still in service, even up until World War II. These things actually had 4 leading wheels, 4 driving wheels, no rear wheels. Next up, we have the 442, the Atlantic. Big power. Well, not big power, but still, these things were fast. They usually had massive driving wheels. These things had 4 leading wheels, 4 probably very large driving wheels, and 2 rear wheels. Next, we have the 444, the Jubilee and or Reading. Now, this is one of those types where there's actually 2 nicknames, but it really depends on which railroad you're talking about. Only really 2 railroads in North America had these. We'll get to that when we actually get to those videos. But these things were, well, the most even you can get. 4 leading wheels, 4 driving wheels, 4 trailing wheels. Next, the 460, the most boring nickname of all time, the 10-wheeler. It has 10 wheels. 4 leading, 6 driving, no trailing. Next up, the 464, the Hudson, or Baltic. Again, another one of those names that only a few railroads had / used. It had 4 leading wheels, 6 driving wheels, 4 trailing wheels. Next up, we have the 280. Finally, different number. The Consolidation. The most popular freight locomotive in the United States and practically all of North America. These things were literally everywhere. You could not find a railroad that didn't have one. It's because they were just good. With 2 leading wheels, 8 driving wheels, no trailing wheels, these things were great for everything from big long coal drags to small freight and branch line service. Next up, the 282, the Mikado. Now, the origin of this nickname is covered in another video. A great video is actually made by Amtrak Guy 365 that actually goes over a lot of these as well. The Mikado has 2 leading wheels, 8 driving wheels, 2 trailing wheels. Next, we have the 480. Now, this is highly a debated one. A lot of people like just to call it a 12-wheeler, and people like myself will call it a mastodon. These were also not very common, but still, a few railroads had them. It has 4 leading wheels, 8 driving wheels, no trailing wheels. Next up, the 482, the Mountain. These were not super common, but they're common enough to actually have a nickname. debated. There's one railroad that only calls it something different: Mountain and or Mohawk. 4 leading wheels, 8 driving wheels, 2 trailing wheels. Next up, the 484. This is the most debated nickname, but the most common one is the Northern. It has 4 leading wheels, 8 driving wheels, and 4 trailing wheels. The pinnacle of steam locomotion. These were some of the most powerful and advanced steam locomotives ever built. Moving on, the 284, the Berkshire. This is essentially the inverse of the Mountain, but these were made for a very specific reason. They have 2 leading wheels, 8 driving wheels, and 4 trailing wheels. Next up, the 210O, the Decapod, or the Russian Decapod, depending on which railroad and or which locomotive you're talking about. Now, the Decapods were not the most common locomotive. In fact, they were actually one of the weirdest. Now, as you start adding more driving wheels, the more stiff the locomotive gets, and you can't really make it around turns that easy. So these weren't around for very long, at least in terms of major freight service. 2 leading wheels, 10 driving wheels, and 0 trailing wheels. Next, we have the 210-2, the Santa Fe type. A lot of people will want to call this a Decapod, Southern Pacific more like it. 210-2, 2 leading wheels, 10 driving wheels, 2 trailing wheels. Next up, the 210-4, the Texas. The Texas type was one of the larger engines built towards the trailing end of steam locomotive technology. Still, very large, very powerful, and only a few railroads had them. They had 2 leading wheels, 10 driving wheels, 4 trailing wheels. Next up, the Southern Pacific, the 410-2. 4 leading wheels, 10 driving wheels, 2 trailing wheels. Stick it, Santa Fe. I'm just kidding. Now we're starting to get to some seriously huge locomotives. The 412-2, the Union Pacific. Literally only one railroad ever built this. It was UP, as the nickname suggests. 4 leading wheels, 12 driving wheels, 2 trailing wheels. Now we're starting getting into a type of a locomotive known as articulated. Now, these are not that hard to understand. They're essentially like a regular steam locomotive, except their driving wheels are split into 2 groups, as to not make the frame so stiff and actually make them easier to go around corners. They had the rear set of wheels usually fixed in place just like a regular steam locomotive, but the frame was split and it was connected by a hinge pin, so the front of the locomotive can turn with the front guiding wheels, making around corners a lot easier. Getting to those types, the 2662. Now, these were some of the most common to appear. So they had 2 leading wheels, 2 sets of 6 driving wheels, and 2 trailing wheels. After that, we have the 2666. Oh my goodness. The devil number. I'm kidding. These were the Alleghenies and or Blue Ridges. Only 2 railroads had these, but they were still monstrous and they were awesome. We have 2 leading wheels, 2 sets of 6 driving wheels, and 1 gigantic 6-wheel trailing truck. Awesome. Now we have the 4664. The Challenger. Now, only a few railroads had these, but they were gorgeous, at least in my opinion. 4 leading wheels, 2 sets of 6 driving wheels, and 4 trailing wheels. Next up, the 2884, the Yellowstone. These, again, were not very common. These were built towards the end of the steam era, and they were still massive, very powerful. 2 leading wheels, 2 sets of 8 driving wheels, and 4 trailing wheels, and more powerful than the final type that I have listed here, the 4884, the big boy. Now, a lot of people, when they associate big steam locomotives, immediately think of the big boy. Only one railroad had these. It was Union Pacific. Go figure. Now, a lot of what I've just said today is a majority of steam locomotives that existed in North America. Of course, there are other types that do exist, and we'll be getting into those when we get to the railroads that own them. However, there's one more thing I need to cover. This letter. If this letter ever appears on the tail end of all these numbers that I've just listed out, that means it's a tank engine. T stands for tank engine. So a lot of these smaller engines did have tank engine versions. However, tank engines were not very common in North America, but they're common enough for, well, us to have this letter to symbolize that, well, it's a tank engine, not just any normal engine. Now, if you don't see a letter, there is a 99.99% chance that this locomotive had a tender. And the tender holds all the coal and water, well, all the fuel and water needed to power a steam locomotive. That will be all for me today. Thank you very much for watching this video. I understand it was a bit of a longer one. I'm going to have a joy editing all this. Thank you for watching the steam locomotives in North America. My name has been Matt, and the next video we'll be getting into the trains themselves. I'm going to have a very fun time with this first video. It's a well-known railroad. Next video, / the first official video of this series, not just the basics and the introduction, will be the introduction of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway. To see you there, and thank you for watching. Bye.